Welcome everyone to today's Grandmothers Live online, Grandmothers New South Wales with Alison Battisson. I'm Gabby Judd from Grandmothers for Refugees New South Wales. I'll hand over to Barbara Ford, also from Grandmothers, who will just do the acknowledgement to country and some basic housekeeping.
Thank you, Gabby. Acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we live. I am from the Wallumattagal country. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of New South Wales. This meeting is being run as a webinar today, so the panellists are probably the only people you will see. If you have any questions at all, please could you put them in chat, and Alison is happy to answer your questions at the end. Alison will also put in chat the donation details so that you can either donate by direct debit or direct bank transfer or by the website. Thanks, Gabby.
Okay, so a huge welcome and thank you to Alison Battisson, founder and head of Human Rights for All. That's a pro bono law firm dedicated to freeing from immigration detention refugees and people who are stateless. Like many of you, I watched the story unfold of their amazing escape from a group of athletes and advocates from Kabul. It was a ray of hope when, in such dark times and despair. So today, Alison is going to tell us about her role and the team's role in, getting that group of people out of Kabul and into Australia. So thank you, Alison, and I'll hand right over to you.
Thank you very much, Gabby and Barbara, and thank you to everyone who's joined. As most people know, we normally at Human Rights for All focus on complex and long-term cases of immigration detention onshore. And through that, we have developed an expertise in information about various countries and in understanding historical, ethnic and political situations. So I've given this talk just once before, but there's been a bit of media on what happened. The Guardian yesterday released a very good podcast with a number of people interviewed. I think it was Guardian International. And the Weekend Australian is going to do a magazine piece on one of the families who, and spoiler alert, who are now in Australia and attempting to settle and figure out how to live a new life in a country where they literally just walked out of their home and left everything. I've got until 2, so I'll try and monitor the time and leave time for questions at the end. But this started on the Sunday night when it became clear that the Taliban were closing in on Kabul. And I'm just looking at my diary here because I believe it was the 15th of August, but it was the Sunday on or around that particular time. And the media had been saying that the Taliban were approaching Kabul, but they weren't yet in Kabul, whereas we had families on the ground who have said they've just swept through our neighbourhood. We are moving in front of them, we are trying to get away, but they are certainly in Kabul. And the reason we knew that is because back in 2018, Human Rights for All acted for the Afghan Invictus Games team. Approximately half of them did not go back to Afghanistan in 2018, in about October, and they sought asylum in Australia. They were all granted refugee status, and that in itself was a journey, and they're going through a journey at the moment with Dr. Munjed El Mudaris to get new legs because they're all single or double amputees. So we built up a great deal of knowledge around, and of course we have Afghan clients in detention, which I'll get to at the end, because what's happening with them is shockingly bad. So the Invictus Games guys, their families were still stuck in Kabul, and they'd all managed to get to Kabul. And we'd had applications for them to be brought to Australia for over 18 months. And we had, throughout the beginning of 2021, written on many occasions to the government saying, it's very clear that once Trump started negotiating with the Taliban without the Afghan government in Qatar, which is just such a shockingly bad move, and with the US withdrawing, that the Taliban will take over, or at least will be a much stronger force. So you need to get these people out who are associated with soldiers who have killed the Taliban. A bit of a no-brainer. So they were the families that started alerting us to what was happening on the ground before it sort of leaked out. And it was very distressing. The next day, other people started contacting us who had family or friends or colleagues in Afghanistan. So on the Monday, we had already started a process for human rights activists, people interested in equality, some sporting people, people who worked for the UN, people who worked for the International Red Crescent, who were just, quite frankly, abandoned. So we started working with their families who were sponsoring them to figure out if there was anything that we could do. Then on Tuesday morning, one of my board members, who's Nikki Dryden and is an ex-Olympian, and is also a human rights lawyer and also has very funky hair, a bit like me, but at the back, and coloured. She just sent me a quick email saying, what are you up to? We need to catch up. I said, oh, doing some things around Kabul. And she said, oh, so am I. And I was like, well, do you want some help? And depending on which way you look at it, that was an amazing thing or a very bad thing to have done, because that resulted in not only myself, but my team, who are actually sort of sitting vaguely around me now, being dragged into this 10-day maelstrom of emotions and work. And within the first day, we were on endless Zoom calls with people in the US, the UK, Denmark, Japan, because of the Paralympics being on, and obviously Australia. And it became clear. Sorry, I'm not sure how to turn that off, so I'll just keep doing it. So, so it became clear that whilst there was a lot of talk from organisations with huge amounts of money and from governments, that no one was actually going to put their hand up to do the work on the ground. And we said, well, we'll do the paperwork. I have quite an interest in history, and we know from history with the Holocaust and with Eastern Europe that people need papers. You don't get to a border with no papers and just be allowed across. There are certain essential things you need. You need papers, you need somebody at the border who can assist you if it's going to be controversial, and you need someone on the other side to then, pull you in and take you to your new place. So we volunteered and said, look, we will do all the paperwork. At the same time, and we are a very small firm. At that point, there was only 2 paid solicitors and a volunteer intern who also worked as a plasterer at the same time. So it was to be able to afford to live. So after we put up our hand, we realised perhaps how large the job was, and we were just sent lists of people and information. And it ended up being over 180 people that within 3 or 4 days we put in applications for. Zali Stegel, who is the first medalist in the Winter Olympics for Australia, and is also an ex-barrister, and of course has the independent seat here in Sydney. She also got involved, obviously very supportive, and quite frankly, she just gave us her stuff, but also handed over her signature and her letterhead and said, just, whatever you need to write for these people, you do it. and make it work. Like, great. Obviously, we figured out the wording with her beforehand, and then we deleted everything, but you know, she was fantastic. So this team came together with Craig Foster, Nikki Dryden, Hayley Carter, who's in the US, she's an ex-Marine and a soccer player, Halida Popal, who was the captain of the Afghan women's soccer team prior to when she had to flee. She's fled her country twice, but the last time was in 2017, so she's in Denmark. Kat Craig, who's in the UK, and she works at Fifth Pro, which is sort of like a union for soccer players, and does huge amounts of very important human rights work. Kirk Fernley, who's a very well-known Australian Paralympian, and of course, Craig Foster, very well-known soccer player. So everyone started working their contacts and trying to figure out how, you know, what were the strengths of each of us. Craig got an undertaking from Marissa Payne, who is the not only the Foreign Affairs Minister, but the Minister for Women, that if we could get these people into the airport, not to the airport, but into the airport, Australia would take them. So they'd either commit to give them a visa or they will give them visas. And we were the first country to put our hands up and say we would do that. And you know, Canada, the US, the UK, and other countries, no one had made that commitment. And most people here will know that I'm normally on the other side of the table to the Australian government and meeting them in court. But I have to say on this, I cannot be critical of this particular time. You know, we were given senior people to access, you know, the first assistant secretary for the refugee intake program, all sorts of contacts that, quite frankly, in the detention network, you're never given. You never actually speak to somebody who can make a proper high-level decision. They keep you away from those people. So the contrast was stark and interesting for us. So we then submitted all these applications, and then the logistical part started. And that was because, you know, we required some further information, and we were given information on the Friday. So we started in earnest on the Monday with other people, on the Tuesday with athletes. On the Friday, we were given information that people with valid visa applications, and that's where Zali's letterhead came into play. It was very important because she confirmed that they'd submitted valid visa applications, so they could wave, you know, an Australian letterhead at a soldier, that those people should move towards the airport. And from that Friday through to the following Thursday, it was, you know, we'd already had very little sleep, but it was a 24/7 operation to track 180 people who were moving in crowds of 20,000 people, who were being directed towards a number of gates all around the airport, and where those gates were was constantly, where they should go to was constantly changing. And there were different family groups, there were different makeup of family groups and people trying to get in. So we had a 24-hour WhatsApp group. I mean, there were so many WhatsApp groups. Advocates know that WhatsApp groups just explode on occasion, and this was one of these times. But we kept this 24-hour group going for 10 days in the end, so that whenever one of us was asleep in one time zone, then somebody else could pick it up and keep supporting and guiding the people through. And Halida Popal was extraordinary because, you know, my diary is not so great. So for people who we couldn't communicate with in English, she worked so hard that she eventually woke up in hospital because she had just collapsed and she hadn't realised that she'd collapsed, and she just exhausted herself. So, I mean, she was quite extraordinary. So then began a process of us really guiding, supporting these people to run the gauntlet of Taliban checkpoints, to figure out how to access the correct gate at the correct time, to figure out how to approach Western troops without being beaten themselves or pepper sprayed, which did happen to some of our people. And that went on for a number of days with no success. At one point, some of the families camped out at a different part of a gate that we thought they wouldn't get in, and the US was sending out Afghan interpreters to bring families in safely and away from the massive crowds. But interestingly, that wasn't an option for Australia. What was also not an option for Australia was France and the UK used the Barron Gate or the Barron Hotel. They would not accept anyone for Australia through that system. The UK wouldn't help us. So that was very interesting when you think of Anzacs and AUKUS or whatever it is that we've done now to alienate everyone in this area. So we had several days where no one made it, and we were starting to think, you know, what do we have to do, and how does this work? And then on the Sunday, I got a message on WhatsApp from an Afghan number that said, "Hi, I'm Corporal X. I'm here to help you." Awesome. And after trying to figure out if he was Taliban or ISIS or not, and trying to lure us into a trap, which was happening, we finally had that missing piece where we had somebody who could guide us in real time to what we should be saying to the athletes and their families, as to what gate they should be going to. And we then started this incredible journey of, on our screens, we had Google Maps, we had Apple Maps, we had, there's something called Maps Insurgency or Maps Hub that had an insurgency map that tracked in real time the gates and the Taliban checkpoints for the gate. So we could help guide people around the gates, the Taliban checkpoints. In the last 2 days before the bomb explosion, you'd press refresh on that map and it would just explode into checkpoints. It was just extraordinary. So we would try and guide people using that. When they got close to the appropriate gate, which was the Abbey Gate for Australia and Australians, we asked for exact GPS coordinates, to take pictures of where they were, what was surrounding them, to take pictures of their clothes, so we could send that to the corporal so they could be identified and pulled in. We'd previously told them, because most of them were women, to dress very conservatively to get to the airport, to take a really bright scarf and hide it near their genitals, to be honest, with their papers and money, and to only bring that out once you were past the Taliban checkpoints. But the Taliban were lining the walls, the turrets, trained guns down on people. And if anyone tried to take a photo, they would confiscate their phones. And then they might see that this was a girl who was an athlete and was somebody that they would want to target. And it was just chaos out the front of the airport, as most people know. I had one family that, I don't know why they trusted me for as long as they did, but their cars were shot at. They had retreated at one point, and then all of a sudden their car was riddled with bullets. Their 2-year-old was trampled in one of the stampedes because the Taliban had a shift change and there was an ordered line beforehand, and then the new people got into, the new Taliban shift workers got in and they started whipping people with electric cattle prods. They were pepper sprayed at one point. There was an attempt to extract this family outside, away from the airport, and they'd been given the incorrect code word, so that didn't work. I mean, it was just a nightmare. And it eventually, there will be a very interesting study, or I hope there'll be an interesting study, into the psychology of the people who made it into the airport and when they made it. Because on my reading, the people who made it first were women athletes from minority groups, so Hazaras. So people who never waited for anyone to help them because no one was ever going to help them, who were used to persecution and used to hardship. And they weren't old and they weren't young. So not a single Invictus Games family made it. They tried for 10 days. They didn't make it into the airport because they had new babies and they had elderly parents and they could not run that gauntlet. But the younger people could do that. So these athletes started getting into the airport. It was extraordinary. And all of a sudden we had 2 and then 5 and then 10 and then 20. And we were ticking off the list. Geez. And then it got hard. It was already pretty hard, let's be honest, but then it got harder because the rules changed. And no one in Australia knew that. The grunts on the ground who were just doing their job had been told that people had to have a valid visa to get in, not just an application. And the Abbey Gate was closed because there were so many threats, credible threats of bombings. And you have to remember, you know, despite Trump's idea of negotiating with the Taliban, you don't just have the Taliban, you have ISIS and you have other militant groups and warlords and resistant groups that are also fighting. So, you know, trying to balance that was incredibly difficult. So the only route became this open drainage ditch that turned into a sewer. And the only people who made it probably in the last week were the ones who went for Australia through that sewer. And that was this awful place where, you know, people had been standing in their own feces and urine for days. It was hot, they were dehydrated, they had guns trained on them from every side, and you didn't just have to get into the sewer. So first of all, you had to get to the sewer, and that was around all sorts of Taliban checkpoints. Then you had to get to the right part of the sewer and avoid some of the British troops. I think at that point was getting a bit sick of what they were doing, so they were being a bit forceful in crowd control. Then you had to get into the sewer and push back down towards the Abbey Gate. So you had to push as far as you could away from any exit so that if there was a bomb or if someone started shooting, there was nowhere you could go. So very frightening. And we're giving people information to take their children, you know, to take their siblings into this area. And in hindsight, that information could have got them killed. So we were very clear that the people on the ground had to, we supported them in them making the best decisions for themselves. You know, we weren't saviours, we did some paperwork and then we provided logistical support in the background, but the people on the ground had to be supported in making the best decisions for them because they could see what was going on around them. We were incredibly lucky with almost all of our athletes and our families. Almost all of them made it. At the end, you know, pulling them out of the ditch, the corporal just kept doing these sweeps of people as we sent photographs and coordinates. But it took days and days again. And there's only, you know, the airport, if you've ever seen inside pictures of the airport, it was packed as well. They were running out of room to store more people and process them when they've been pulled in. And, you know, if you can imagine, you get pulled up and out of this sewer, you're filthy, you don't have anything, you don't have any medication or water. You get taken to a triage area to figure out which country you should be shuttled to in the airport, where there's some basic medical care, but you're certainly not going to have a shower or, you know, be fed or anything. And then if your country, and this is what started to happen, because some people had been trying to get into the airport for so many days, the rules when they left was that you just needed a visa application. By the time they got in, you needed a visa. And so they would get to the triage point after going through this, week-long terrible experience, and then being told, no, you can't come in. So I had the awful experience of some human rights defenders who had made it in. The woman was pregnant, heavily pregnant, like 7 months pregnant, and I went to sleep for 2 hours because I thought it was fine. By the time I woke up, they had been removed from the airport. So they'd run this gauntlet. They were so close, and we just didn't know the rules had changed, and we couldn't get anyone on the ground to go in and save it. And they never made it out. They never made it back to the airport. So that was, incredibly distressing. And they've been identified by the Taliban as going to the airport to escape. So clearly they're people that the Taliban will be interested. But then we had some other families who were denied access but taken to the American camp, and we were able to get the corporal, who is an absolute hero on the ground, to go and collect them again. Go, oh, no, actually there's been a misunderstanding. And with this one family that I became very close to, and it spent 100 hours communicating with them on WhatsApp. That was, I must admit, when I finally lost it, 10 p.m. on one night when we'd celebrated that they'd gotten in. And then they said, they're not letting us in, they're sending us to the Americans. Ali, do something. I'm like, I don't control the Americans. I don't, just hang back from the line, just buy us some time, we'll do whatever we can. And it was, by this point, we were in contact with some military people at the Joint Operations Office and with a couple of politicians, and I made a few calls where I made it very clear that what the media didn't know about what we had been doing in terms of the Paralympians being prioritised, they would know, and they'll know it very quickly, and I want my family. And I'm owed this family. The Australian government is going to trade off the goodwill of getting all these athletes in, and they will not abandon this one family. So you do it, and you do it now. And 5 minutes later, the corporal turned up and got this family from the American side and brought them in, and then they got the magic blue tick on their hand, and that meant you were cleared to fly. So that was certainly an experience in which I think they realised in the sound of my voice that I was about to be very unreasonable, which is sometimes what you need to do. That was the last one of our families that got through. They were with two other kids, really, late teens. And this family, 7 of them had come to the airport. 2 of the girls played football, mum, dad, quite elderly, baby, and the 4 siblings. And it became clear the mum and the dad and the baby they just could not do the pressure of running this gauntlet. So the 4 kids had screamed their goodbyes to them, in this awful crush of a crowd where you're being separated and pulled, and, people were trampled to death. It wasn't some remote threat. You could be trampled to death. You could be, pushed up against a wall and squished to death. You could be shot by the Taliban. You could, there are some accounts that some Afghan army officers given weapons by the US were also shooting their weapons. So, there were threats on multiple sides. And 2 of the siblings made it in and made it onto a plane. And then 2 were sitting in the sewer and just luckily sent me a picture of where they were, their coordinates, and they were picked up in the final sweep. And their siblings didn't know until they were in Dubai and they saw their 2 siblings walking towards them and realised that they'd made it, because there were no communications. People were being flown all over the place to, secret airports in the UAE that everyone knew about, so weren't that secret. The Americans towards the end, which is very interesting, were flying their planes to Saudi Arabia. What is the agreement that was made there? And yeah, some very interesting geopolitical events we were more exposed to. And eventually the corporal said, this phone's going off in an hour. This was on the Wednesday or the Thursday, sort of 10 days after Kabul fell. I asked if he was finishing his tour of duty, and he said yes, he was flying out tonight. So we knew the window had closed. And there were families and people with Australian visas who just didn't make it into the airport, who had sat in that sewer for days and had just didn't have that final connection with somebody on the ground. And then sort of our role, I mean, it was this massive effort, and I began to realise that I didn't need sleep anymore, and somebody pointed out that's when you become manic and you have a nervous breakdown. So I was like, yeah, okay, I think it might be time to stop. And then the bomb went off. We had finished all the people on our list, and some of the organisations who perhaps should have put their hands up earlier to assist certain people, FIFA, started trying to act, and were negotiating with the Qatari government, were chartering planes. I said, you can't just negotiate with the Qatari government and the Taliban. You've got ISIS, you've got all these other. Do you know how complex Afghanistan is? And clearly they didn't. So they were trying to load people on buses when the bomb went off. Very, very dangerous. So, since that event, all of the people have arrived in Australia. They've all been through quarantine. The majority, if there's any grandmas in Melbourne, the majority are settling in Melbourne. It was just coincidence that most of them were sent there, so the rest decided to join them. There are a few in Sydney. Unlike many of the other Afghans who were pulled out in that initial 4,000, these particular people and families where the parents did make it don't have the community connections. They don't have the sibling coming and bringing them food or taking them for a drive or getting them out and about. So there's certainly a role there. There's about 100 Afghan refugees at the Bella Vista Hotel at the Quest Hotel in Sydney. So there's an ongoing role there, and extraordinarily, people continue to trickle out. So, I mean, we also did, everyone knows the story of the Paralympians, which is why I didn't speak about it that much. Actually, that's how Eric, my unpaid intern, who's just over my computer here, eventually became paid, because he did, Zakia's, who's the female Paralympian, he did her application. So you have Olympic bodies, Paralympic bodies, disability groups, governments. It was left to an unpaid intern in lockdown in a very small human rights law firm in Australia to actually put pen to paper and just do the work. I had a chairman of a large Australian corporate personally contact me who I didn't know, who just said, how can we help? And I said, look, I need my unpaid intern to be working with me. He's gone plastering today. I need him. Can your organisation give me $50,000 so I can employ him? And by that night, yes. So that was, and this is an organisation who would never be seen to be associated with us normally, but, very privately and quietly, and we can't name them, put it through, recognising the good work.
Wow.
But that was the experience was private citizens, and quite frankly, mainly women, who just put their hands up and said, we're needed, these people need something, let's give it a go, and let's be sensible, let's combine all our strengths. So, and people continue to trickle out. One of the Paralympians who I applied for afterwards has just turned up in Macedonia. Oh, all right. A Hazara man who's disabled, who couldn't do the airport gauntlet, managed to get to Pakistan, and the Australian government just flew him out 2 days ago. But he'd been granted a visa. So that pipeline, though, has dried up.
That's extraordinary, gosh.
Yeah, it was pretty, it was very full on, and they certainly don't train you for this at uni or law school, but it's, you know, life experience. If you travel a lot, one of the things that we said to the women was that, you know, tell the Taliban that your husband is in the airport and he'll be very angry if you can't make it, which I learned from Indonesia when, you know, there was some riot about fuel and I couldn't get to the airport. And when I did, they wouldn't let me in. And, you know, and I speak Indonesian, and it, you know, it was this disaster. And eventually I said, oh, my partner, who's a man, will be very angry if I can't make it through. Oh, in that case, off you go through. So like, all right, it worked in one Islamic country. We'll try, you know, Indonesia's Islamic light, but yeah. So, and then, you know, to see the Paralympians competing was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, no, that was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we did. And we continue with some of that work because obviously Afghanistan's not a great place to be.
Look, that's amazing that so many questions, Alison. I just one that's probably not too long a question. That 180 people, when they went to the airport, were they in one group or were they all over the place?
So we tried to get everyone together because we realised they were going to have to start to be identified. And in particular, getting the kids to wear bright clothing because they wouldn't be done by the Taliban. But with 20,000 people, they spread everywhere.
Okay, another question. You said the support given was completely different, comparing the support from the government from those people fleeing Afghanistan, comparing the work that you do with people in immigration detention. Can you expand on why you think that difference is?
I think the overarching issue here, there was no deterrent policy that the Australian government was attempting to comply with, as they do with immigration detention. And for some reason, so the Australian government wanted a win. They wanted a political win, and getting female Paralympians in particular, but female athletes otherwise, they could boast about it, talk about it. And that's why the story about the Paralympians broke when it did. I think was on the Monday or the Tuesday morning. I lost track of time, I'm going to be honest. The Monday or the Tuesday morning, we didn't want it to break, but the French had vaguely kidnapped our Paralympians, so that the French and the British pulled them in and then very quickly got them on a plane, and then they just disappeared. But before they disappeared, and they were taken to Paris, and then they were taken to Japan. Before they disappeared, we received photographs from them, you know, saying thank you, but clearly staged photographs where you could see the French and the British uniforms, and we're like, they are lining up for their own press. And the Australian government wanted the story.
Gosh. I'm going to try and go through some of their questions in the chat. We've had a question about where are the people staying in Melbourne. You also mentioned some people at the Bella Vista in Sydney. If any of our members or anybody watching this wanted to help and get involved, is there, rather than just turning up with, you know?
Yes, that would be a poor idea. So in Sydney, Addison Road is doing a lot.
Okay,
So you can coordinate with them. And in Melbourne, Women on Side, which is made up of ex-Matildas. And they are assisting the people in Melbourne. They are spread throughout sort of university accommodation. Some are in the city, some are otherwhere. So that people are now starting to find accommodation out and about. So the answer for Melbourne is not sure, but for a while in the city, not sure now.
Sure. I'll just make a comment here. One of our much loved and very involved grandmothers died not so long ago at the age of 93, and her family are moving in, a Afghan family, a pregnant mum, 2-year-old and the husband. So we're really happy about that, and she would have been too. So it's just a comment.
Fantastic.
So back into the chats.
There's a question in the chat about an orderly queue from Jane. That would have been great, wouldn't it? So, I mean, it was chaos. It was absolute chaos. There was no orderly queue. There was no clear direction where to go. You would constantly go to the North Gate, go to the Abbey Gate. You know, there was a Taliban gate. To be clear, we were never told to go to the Taliban gate. You know, go to and from the gates, retreat for a while. It's not going to be open for another day. It's going to be open at 4 a.m. in the morning. That's the best time to go. You know, it was chaos. And it wasn't even organised chaos. It was just chaos. So there was no orderly queue. And then, you know, people like the Invictus Games families who had applications in for 18 months, they're still there. You know, and it cannot. Australia did do very well to take 4,000 in that 10 days. I mean, it really was an extraordinary effort by people on the ground. We need to do better to recognise that just because, for example, athletes could literally fight their way to the front of a queue or withstand standing in a sewer for 5 days, that shouldn't be how the refugee humanitarian program works. You know, young mothers with babies, they're stuffed. They couldn't make it. So that, like with anything, there's no queue to join. You know, it just happens randomly.
Jane has put a question. Why do you think the USA, France and the UK would not assist Australia?
I don't know, but it was very strange, and it was the most clear. You know, obviously I was saying to the corporal on the ground, these people are near the Barron Gate, for example, can't they just be taken in there and then, you know, taken to the Australian part of the airport? The UK doesn't even need to take them to the UK. And it was, no, that will not happen. I mean, it was very clear. So I do not know what had happened there. So some Swedes, and there was one other country that were pulling in people on Australian visas and then taking them to the Australian area, but not, I'm not sure what happened to our, what are we, the allies of the willing. I know there was the axis of evil, and then there was something about the allies of the willing. So, yeah.
Are you still trying to get people out? What's happening with, you know, obviously more got left behind?
Yes, I am. I have my day job trying to get people out of detention in Australia, and then at most nights I'm working on other cohorts. To be clear, the athletes, we didn't prioritise them over anyone else. They asked, and I have quite an athletic background. I'm an ex-boxer and kickboxer, volleyballer, you know, all sorts of things. So
rollerblader.
yeah. Roller derby now. And so it just came as a natural fit, and they took our advice. So I did have some other groups, human rights groups, who said, we've got lists. These people should be prioritised. Yes, they should. Can you help? Yes, my advice is we need to do full applications for them. No, we don't want to do that. They should just be taken. Those people didn't make it out. So there are now other groups that we are very quietly trying to assist, where we're trying to do the same approach, but you know, we certainly can't get them on planes anymore.
You also mentioned, Alison, early on about trying to help those that were already here, those Afghans that were already here. I know the government keeps saying, well, they'll never get permanent visas and they'll never have, you know, family unification. So
there's a number of things here. People, Afghans in immigration detention who have very supportive advocates and friends, those people have sponsored the families to come to Australia. So we've done a couple of those. And the irony is that the family might get to Australia before the person's out of detention. Yeah. It happened with Syria. There are a couple of people in detention and their parents arrived. So quite extraordinary.
So those in detention could potentially get permanent visas.
No.
No. But their family could.
Yep, the irony. And we know, studies show us that people who settle most well have their families with them.
Yeah.
You know, and so they've got this unit and then they can gradually go out from there. So, you know, how to create some distrust in your new country if you turn up and daddy's still in detention. We had started putting in ministerial intervention requests for Hazaras in detention to be allowed to reapply for visas over 12 months ago. We could see the writing was on the wall. These people were clearly owed protection, re-invite them to apply. We've had some get through and we're in the process. Some have waited for over a year. They are Hazara Shia Afghans. I mean, and apparently the minister doesn't want to be overwhelmed with applications.
Yeah.
That's not how the world works, honey. So we continue to work with those where we can, with those people in detention. But it's very distressing for, I mean, you know, they were all offered, you know, counselling for, you know, how to deal with the fall of Afghanistan. Let them out. That might help them so they could sponsor their family.
Yeah. Right. With the athletes themselves, how many brought families with them? How many were on their own? Or
there are a number on their own or with siblings. So I'm not sure of the precise numbers, but there would be more than 20 or 30 who are by themselves or just with siblings who are 19, 20. I mean, we were trying to explain to, you know, illiterate parents to, because we didn't want the Australian government to be accused of kidnapping children, but some of them were unaccompanied minors. I was like, all right, we need you know, luckily there's a form that the Afghan embassy in Britain had for permission for unaccompanied children to travel. So we're trying to communicate with parents as to how to sign this particular form on an iPhone that some neighbours handed over. I was like, we need it before they get on the plane. You know, and there's a thumbprint. Like, that'll do. Let's go.
Yeah.
But logistically, you know, you've got to think about all these things. You know, this person, you know, looks very young. Are they in fact under 18? Yes. Well, I can't get on a plane without parental consent, and there's a bit of a civil war happening.
Yeah, what happens if there are unaccompanied minors? Does that make the minister their guardian? I know that used to happen.
Potentially, yeah. There's legislation on that, guardian legislation on that, yeah. No. There's a question about new arrivals being able to secure permanency. The answer is no one knows, but probably. So the government, again, showing what they could do if they turn their minds to it, i.e. detention, they gave everyone, we didn't even know what visa these people were going to get. We put in these generic forms that had lots of options and they were given 449 visas. The reason they were given those is that the health requirements were waived.
Is that the 90-day ones, is it?
Yes, the 90-day ones where, you know, they didn't have to have their TB scans and things. So all the people in Australia are now going through an interview process with departmental officials who are, you know, completely overwhelmed. So I suspect they'll roll on to another 3 months 449. And then I suspect they will roll on to permanent protection visas and be able to properly settle.
I mean, Alison, do you see hope in the future, you know, if there's a change of government, because Labor has said they will give everybody permanent protection visas. Do you see that it's going to happen? I mean, if the government changes?
I think it's beholden to us to hold them to that.
Right.
They have said that. And quite frankly, you know, Christina Keneally has been getting a lot of mileage out of the Bilowiya family.
Yeah.
There's a cost.
That's right.
And they should be held to it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. We've still got a few minutes for more questions, 5 minutes maybe. Oh, no, a bit more than that. Any more questions?
Question from Barbara about any chance anyone else will get out. Barbara, is that from detention or from Kabul?
You're on mute, Barbara.
Yeah, from Kabul. Yeah.
Maybe.
Hard to say.
Does that depend on the Taliban letting people out?
Maybe. I can't. Look, it
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think it's be really. Did you say there is actually a study going on to see, you know, the makeup of people that actually made it out? You said there were mostly women, minority groups, Hazaras. Were you just saying there should be a study?
There should be a study. I think it'll be fascinating to see, you know, because we, in encouraging these families and these athletes, we used a lot of sporting term. You know, this is the final half. This is your last push. It's just a flesh wound. You know, you're the walking wounded. You can keep going. You know, you'll get a drink at the end of the game. Come on, make the final push. And they responded because they're used to being uncomfortable. And I think for us, because, you know, I've broken more than 15 bones. I'm, you know, through sport and all sorts of other things that, you know, I could look at something and, you know, a picture of somebody who's been assaulted and you can see the obvious marks and I'm like, oh, well, keep going. You know, you can still walk. What's wrong with you? You know, to not get upset about that. You know, the ultimate aim is through that gate. You just need to make it. And if you have to crawl, I'll support you in that. But you crawl.
It's an incredible level of resilience. Somebody's always put a question in there. I'm sorry. And
deep emotional support.
Yes.
Look, I can.
A good question.
It is a very good question. I mean, I have a therapist, so certainly I have been seeing my therapist. Sometimes I can't re-listen where I've given interviews and things. I just can't do that.
Yeah.
Nikki still bursts into tears about it. It wasn't this experience of we've saved a whole lot of people and aren't we amazing? It was we supported some people and some of them made it. You know, yesterday it was reported that the Taliban had beheaded a soccer player who didn't make it out, a female soccer player who didn't make it out. So it's, you know, it's never ending and you can't save everyone.
No. Look, of course, you know, you and your team have done an extraordinary job and you keep doing that. I'll just urge people again to please donate to Human Rights for All because, you know, they can't work on nothing. And, you know, that would be a really good way to support the firm, but also to make Alison and her team feel that, you know, we're out there sort of barracking for her as well. So the link is in the chat, or you can email me, or you can go onto their website. So that, you know, it's really important to do that.
And I'm just going to introduce the other two.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Lucky and Eric, do you want to come around? They're literally just next. So
hi. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Eric, thank you. Mastering for anyone?
Yep.
So you're both interns, or just Eric's an intern?
Eric's now a junior solicitor with us, and Zaki's very senior and is the big brain. So we want to try and get him on the High Court.
Right.
So they're working on the COVID hotel in Melbourne at the moment to see what we can do.
Right.
About people stuck there.
Great job, guys. And one of our grandmothers, Wendy, and also Ingrid have put a plug in there for the Human Rights for All challenge. Do you want me to talk about it, or
go for it, Gabby? No, go for it.
Okay, I'll do my best, and you people can fill in the gaps. So, in past years, grandmothers have together, I think, supported Human Rights for All in the City de Surf as a fundraiser. So it didn't happen last year, or they had a virtual one last year. And the same thing happened this year, obviously, because of COVID, they're not going to have the City de Surf. But Human Rights for All have set up this challenge 2021 to get, well, I guess not just their team, but their friends and grandmothers have partnered with that, and to do some sort of challenge that will raise funds. So for example, Alison is doing, I think, a 15-kilometre roller skate ride. Wendy from Grandmothers is doing a walk, and Ingrid as well, I think a marathon, I think 15 kilometres. I'll probably get it all wrong. Barbara here is going to be doing a dance with her partner every day, I think. I'm doing a 10-kilometre kayak paddle, and we're roping in other people to do it. So you can go shortly to the Grandmother's Facebook page to donate to sponsor us, you know, in those challenges. And is there also human rights? I mean, I know there's that closed group. Are you putting it on your Human Rights for All Facebook page, Alison, so people can go?
I think so. I mean, this has actually been organised by, you know, a mid-20s guy called Nick Cora, and I've just left him to it. So okay. I think it is. I'll make sure that it is. But I think if grandmas go through you, Gabby, or Barbara, you're very organised, and we love seeing the purple. So.
Okay, so you've got to watch all those spaces. So it should be up on the Grandmothers one. In a couple of us have already got sponsors, so that's great.
There's a question for Susan. Anything we can do as grandmas in Melbourne for the Park Hotel?
Yeah. Well, that's the one where they've got the COVID outbreak, isn't it?
Yes, and we, building on a case last week, and this is a huge ask, but if anyone does have 2 rooms or a bungalow that is separate in which they could accommodate a refugee and a Serco officer, because the person's detained as long as the Serco officer's around, but it's not a place of detention, then that would be useful to us for a particular case at this point.
Okay, so call out to Grandmothers from Victoria to also put the word out. So Kerry Levinson has said from Grandmothers, knowing who to trust is so complex. How do you do that?
It depends on the situation. At Human Rights for All, we have a no dickhead policy. So if the person doesn't feel right straight away, they're not in. It's difficult, and you have to be kind and compassionate to everyone. In you know, advocates, refugees, other people. It's everyone's got their own thing going on. But I trust the Grandmas for Refugee brand, so I trust that they've been vetted and who is a member.
All right. Any last minute questions? We're just about out of time. One from Jan Gavin. Oh, okay, she's put the website. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. I've got a call in 2 minutes.
Yeah, all right.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alison.
And for attending. And, you know, any questions, email Gabby or myself. I'll always be up to answer.
And thank you, Alison, and your team. We'll talk to you again soon, I'm sure. Okay, bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.